Hey everybody, Mason here. First video that I'm doing about the comparisons between the Gen 3 LS versus the Gen 3 Hemi. The swaps are becoming a lot more popular, and there's not a great comparison out there for physically showing the engine side by side. You know, there's a lot of information out there as far as here's the specs of this and that, but I haven't really seen anything yet where anybody laid the two side by side, tore apart, measured everything, and really got the chance to see the differences between them. So I decided to actually lay two of them out side by side. That's an 04 L33. So this is the aluminum block with the 799 heads, Gen 4 rods. On the right here for an LS. And then this is an 04 Hemi, 5.7 Hemi out of an 04 Ram. I actually removed this about a week ago from the pick and pull to put in my Dodge Dart project that's back there in a big mess. Originally my plan was to go with the LS. I'm a big LS fan, done quite a few LS swaps, I'm very familiar with it. Obviously, it's a cheap, easy way to get the small aluminum block, which is great weight savings, not to mention the simplicity of the LS and all the popularity as far as parts and the cost difference between the two. Now, I actually picked up this Hemi for about 150 bucks. I had to painstakingly pull it out of the pick and pull, which is actually one of the easier engine removals I've ever done. But unfortunately, this does have the typical 03 to 08 Hemi valve seat failure. It did drop its intake valve on cylinder number 2. And then I was actually able to score a set of these Eagle heads off an 09 Chrysler Aspen while I was at the pick and pull. So these are Eagle heads on an 04 bottom end that I got for about 150 bucks. Got the wiring harness in the transmission, and the rest of it's all laying over in that pile. But so this is going to be kind of a learning experience because I, like I said, have been so familiar with the LS stuff. But you know, when you really sit down and you compare the two of them after taking both apart, there's a lot of similarities between the two. Major differences, obviously, from the old generations of engines. I mean, they're both. One's a Gen 3 small block Chevy, the other one's a Gen 3 Hemi. So I figured it would be a good chance to really show them both kind of broke down. We can start over here. The Hemi, you know, one of the things everybody brags about with the LS is the size of the cam core. It lets you run ridiculous valve lift, and everything's very gentle on the lifters and the cam bearings and such. And the Hemi actually appears to have a slightly bigger cam core. It certainly feels heavier in your hands, but I do find it kind of interesting that you don't typically see the Hemi aftermarket camshafts with as much lift as the LS stuff. You know, it's not that uncommon at all to see LS, you know, aftermarket camshafts in the 630, 640 lift range. You know, whereas a lot of the Hemi stuff really only seems to hover around 560, 570. You don't typically see the big high lift. But we can start here with the lifters. This here is the non-MDS lifter out of the Ram engine. You can see next to the LS. They are very, very similar in diameter. In fact, I can't remember. They may actually be the same diameter. But the roller on the Hemi lifter actually does appear to be a little wider. Now, these aren't LS7 lifters. These are out of the L33. But kind of interesting to see that it's not as captured, obviously, as the LS lifter is. And I don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing as far as the strength of it or how it oils. Push rods. Push rods are also kind of a big difference between them. Now, on an LS, all 16, all the same size. I guess unless you're running some real radical different valves or something, or lifters, or you may end up with different push rod lengths, but a Hemi, there's a drastic difference. Very, very big difference between the two. The intakes are shorter, and the longer is the exhaust, and that's because of the canted valve. It has to reach further from the camshaft to get to the exhaust rockers. But they do both appear to have the same ball design on the end, almost identical, and they're both 5/16. So, maybe there's some interchangeability between them. I'm not sure. Moving to the pistons and rods. Now, everybody loves the L33 because obviously it's a cheap, easy way to get an aluminum block, but they're also stuffed with the Gen 4 rods. Now, I don't have a Gen 3 rod next to me to compare the two of them, just for that difference, but there's definitely a sizable difference between it and the Hemi rod, especially when you flip the Gen 4 LS rod around, and you can see the width difference at the journal. Definitely appears to be a lot more significant design. Now you can also see how it's not smooth here. They are both of a fractured rod design. So, they're very, very strong, but the Gen 4 LS definitely appears to be a lot beefier, heavier design. You can also see that the wrist pin are at different heights. The wrist pin does sit lower in the LS piston, and the LS piston does seem to be more of a deep skirt design instead of the short skirt from the Hemi. They're both threaded rods. The bolts bolt right in. They're not through bolted like some of the old small block stuff was. And they both use 11mm or 7/16 for the bolt heads. So again, very, very similar. Cranks, also kind of a similar design. I don't have my calipers on handy to measure all the journals and stuff, but the LS there's got the pressed on reluctor, whereas the Hemi it bolts on. So you can actually interchange that with, if you wanted to run, a 58 tooth reluctor off one of the newer Hemis, you could actually bolt it on with some adapting, I believe. The other difference too is the timing sprocket on the crank. They're both keyed between the LS and the Hemi. They're both keyed, but the Hemi it's a slip fit, whereas the LS is a press fit design. So that's on there for good. It can be removed, but obviously not as easily when you are doing different timing chain sets as the Hemi. Now let's move to the actual blocks and heads themselves, because obviously, just looking at the difference between the two of them, the Hemi's massive. A tiny little LS sitting next to the Hemi. So I wanted to get a tape measure on these two and just get a general idea about the different widths, because it always seems that you see guys with rock bouncers or Ultra 4 rigs or any custom project, and everything's all LS, but if the Hemi's not that much different in width and dimensions, then maybe a Hemi could be a good option for certain people, especially the Mopar enthusiasts. So, the Hemi appears to measure almost 26 inches wide, about 26 inches wide from the outside of the valve cover to the outside of the valve cover. Versus the LS, again, this is kind of rough, but the LS appears to be about 20.5 inches wide. Granted, you have sensors, and I do have some of the exhaust bolts threaded back into it. So, big difference in width. 6 inches is a lot, especially when it comes to getting into tighter firewall or engine bays and firewall clearance and header clearance, even for that matter. The Hemi, now I do have the valve covers, the coil packs still on it. There are people I've seen that have made custom spark plug wires to run into the valve covers on the Hemi to get rid of the coil with a coil on plug design for more of the vintage look. But I figure for the most part, everybody that would be doing one of these swaps, or at least would be interested in the video, would retain the coil-on plug design. Whereas the LS, it's very, very easy because of the coil near plug design to just end up with remote mounted coils, and you may not necessarily end up with the coils on the valve covers. So I did leave them off the L33, not trying to do that as some sort of big advantage for the LS being smaller, but it is very common for people to relocate the coils on these. So I didn't set the coil packs on it. But I guess if everybody really cared, I could always take another comparison measurement, so let me know in comments. But height-wise, you know, both these engines are sitting right here on the floor on their main caps. They're also, and I forgot to talk about that as well, deep skirt blocks. Both of them are definitely deep skirt blocks. It's easier to see for sure because of the difference between the cast iron and the aluminum on the LS. But the Hemi also right there separates as well. So they're both cross-bolted mains, but the LS is wider, and it definitely does use the 6-bolt design instead of just the 4. In fact, the Hemi appears to be about 9 inches wide across the mains, whereas the LS is over 10 and a half. So definitely another inch of material there. Definitely helps with some of the stability in the bottom end, and that extra set of bolts is a good idea too. So height-wise between the two, the Hemi here appears to be, you know, approximately 16, 17 inches tall. You know, now granted, that's not including the intakes. Again, I didn't include intakes on these because there's so many different options as far as intakes go that it's really going to vary between your application. Now, one of the big differences it's easy to spot between the LS and the Hemi is definitely this front cover design, or where the front cover bolts to the engine, the timing cover and such, which the water pump's all incorporated into. Definitely kind of a unique design with the coolant return up in here, but and it unfortunately does add quite a bit of height right there to the block. But I guess, you know, it's really not that much taller than your intake ports. You know, we got 15.5 inches to the top of that peak. And then the intake ports that do sit flat and level are about 14 inches off the 14.5 inches, I'm sorry, off the bottom of the engine. All right, so moving on to the LS here. Height-wise, we're at about, 16.5, 17 inches as well. So there's really not any height difference between the LS and the Hemi. Obviously, your oil pans may vary. So the big difference there seems to be the width. Now, what about the length? The length of these two engines, because obviously, like we said, with tight firewalls, and engine bays, the length could definitely appear to be a difference. And the engines are pretty much identical. You know, measuring from the bell housing to the front of the Hemi, we got about 21.25 inches. The LS, measuring again from the bell housing to the front of the block, we're at 20.5. So as you can see, it's an inch. An inch definitely does make a difference. But and I probably should have the front covers on both and all the accessories. Now, I'm sure everybody knows there's 3 different sets of accessories for the LS, the truck, the F-body Camaros, and then the Corvette stuff. And they all have different height or widths. They all have different offsets. So they will eventually change the length of the engine. The Hemis, you rather have truck or car. It's pretty simple. And even the truck stuff, I was quite impressed how low profile it was. So complete, you might find out the LS is actually a touch longer. Now you can see the bell housing pattern. This is actually the same as all the old LA small blocks for the old Chrysler motors, except it does not have the top hole drilled. One thing I didn't really find online when I was doing any of this stuff, and I discovered and I took it apart, these are standard bolts. The bell housing pattern on these are actually 3/8 on 16, which is obviously the same as the old Mopar blocks use. But, I guess you would figure a new engine, everything would be metric. The small block, or the LS, is packed full of metric. I've actually not found a single piece of standard hardware on one of these. So, definitely difference there. And again, from the back here, it definitely shows you the difference between the smaller main, which appears to be about 6.5 inches on the Hemi, versus the wide 8.25 inches for that rear main cap on the LS. So it definitely goes to show you why you see so many LS motors in the 800-900 horsepower range on stock bottom ends. I mean, that great crank support, very heavy duty rods. They definitely have a little bit of an advantage there over the Hemi. Another thing that I'll point out here too is the difference in height between the cam and the crank. The LS, the cam sits very low on the block, and you end up with a very short timing chain. But the Hemi, obviously a lot taller. It's from what I understand, the reason is to help with the candid valves, trying to reach all the way to the rocker arms on the Hemi. Okay, I just took a second to remove the heads from both. Now, with the heads removed, now there really doesn't appear to be much of a difference at all between the engines. Setting side by side here, the heads, that's where you see a lot of the really big difference in the width in these engines. Height-wise, the Hemi head is definitely taller, but it's substantially wider. Let me grab the tape measure again here. An LS head, approximately 7.5 inches, and 7 5/8 maybe. Whereas your Hemi head, where it bolts to the block, is 8 inches, but look at how much it overhangs here where the valve cover bolts. So overall, out there, in the edge of the port here, you're about 9.5 inches. So there's definitely a substantial difference there. But now with just the bare blocks, you can see they're very similar structure, using these small bolts to seal up and around the lifters. Unfortunately, you have to remove the heads for both of them to remove the lifters. But you can see the difference. Now I know it's kind of dark, how deep the LS lifters sit, again because that cam sits very low on the block. Whereas look at the shallow angle on the Hemi lifters. I mean, they really go in, at quite the low angle, because they have to push way out to reach all the way to those candid valves. They both use a lifter tray design, a plastic tray design. When I remove these, I know everybody suggests that you have to remove or replace the lifters and trays anytime you're really doing this and stuff. The LS, when I took it apart, was upside down, which would help keep the lifters in the trays, and still only half of them stayed in the trays. However, the Hemi, again, these are very similar miles, held on to all but one of its lifters. So the lifter tray design in the Hemi actually seems to be a lot better, whereas you might not have to replace the trays every time you have the lifters and heads out, like you should in LS. So that might be an advantage for the Hemi. Again, now you can also see just how tall that front cover does stand up where the coolant return is in the block. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was crankshaft position sensors. Almost identical locations on each engine, right down in the passenger rear corner on both. Oil pressure sensors are quite different. You got your oil pressure sensor and your pedestal right here. On the Hemi, it's kind of neat. You got these two ports here where you can take the plugs out, and you could actually add oil cooler lines to that. I think that's kind of a neat feature. Definitely have to take advantage of that. Whereas the LS, you have the oil housing all the way down here on the bottom. And it actually threads onto the pan. So your pan will have to be adapted for, some sort of a remote oil filter, or actually the LS pan is right here. Or your filter, your correct filter. This is a real popular thing. A lot of these truck pans have this oil block-off plate here for an oil cooler, and you can actually drill that. I believe, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I think it's 21/64ths, and you can drill that for an 1/8" pipe tap, 1/8" NPT, and that's a great place to run an oil pressure sensor for aftermarket gauges on swaps. And then you have the factory oil pressure sensor and factory camshaft position sensor on the LS up there. But, the final thing I think I wanted to touch on was actually the mounts. I left the bolts in the Hemi. I guess it might be a little difficult to see the difference between them because they're all the same rust color. But you got 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now it is a rectangle pattern, just like an LS. They are very, very similar. They're not quite exactly the same, but I've read online where guys have taken LS swap mounts, the square mounting plates or rectangle mounting plates that bolt to the block, and actually just been able to oblong a couple holes to allow them to work on a Hemi. So might be kind of a neat thing to look into. Might be something I might have to do if I can't find the appropriate universal mounts for the Dart, since I am building my own K-frame with it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, if anybody has any questions or anything, please feel free to leave stuff in the comments. I will, I'll have these both apart for quite a little while. They both unfortunately need to go to the machine shop. The LS had, I don't know if something got down into the cylinder or what happened on this one. It is pretty tore up through here, but maybe just an overbore, or it could even be just aluminum deposits on there, and I'll have to get everything looked at. And I'm hoping it doesn't need an overbore, though. I'd really like to just reuse these pistons and throw them back together. Just replace the damaged one. But the Hemi for sure is going to need some bore work. These are pretty deep, and in fact I was playing around with my bore gauge for a little while, and it's going to take at least 2 or 3 thousandths of a cut just to get these out of here, as well as some of the damage here from when the valve seat dropped. So unfortunately, I guess that is kind of the name of the game when you're going to get junkyard engines out of pick and pull. But it was definitely worth the shot. Now here's a good underside of the Eagle Hemi heads. And there's a lot of people that complain, well, they're not a true Hemi like the old ones because of the dual plugs and this quench area here. But you know what? The quench area helps with having to run ridiculous dome on the pistons. The factory Hemi pistons do have a little bit of a dome, but they, it helps naturally aspirated compression, and these definitely have a real small, tight chamber, so they should give me a good bump in compression. Now on the LS head, I believe this is the one that was tore up. Yes, that's the damaged one from whatever got in here. And actually, it does appear that there's a little nick in cylinder 5 as well. So I'll have to probably just replace this head, unless anybody wants to suggest a good machine shop that can do some welding and repair work on that bowl without it being too ridiculous in price, because these really aren't that expensive for just another used set of heads. But that's typical LS chamber. We have a quench pad up here and a small one down there, and the single plug design. And They also both run the same valves. We have 2-inch valves and 1.55 valves on the exhaust. I might have messed that up. That might be a 1.6 on these 799 heads. But they're definitely, it's a 2-inch intake valve and a 1.55 valve for the Hemi, for sure. So, all right. Well, guys, I hope everybody enjoyed, and I'm hoping that I can keep trying to document some of this car project, some of the engine builds, and might even go over some of the step-by-step stuff as far as doing the standalone harness conversions. And you know, like I said, I've done half a dozen or more LS stuff, so the Hemi's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, but the information's out there. And I don't know. I guess that pretty much covers everything with these. So, if anybody's got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and there could be some more videos to come. Thanks a lot, guys.